Hello and welcome to The Booking Club, the podcast that brings you today's leading authors and commentators from a table at their favourite places to eat and drink. I'm your host, Jack Aldane, and on this episode, I'm going to be speaking to author Elizabeth Oldfield about her new book, Fully Alive, at the Anchor and Hope in Southwark. I'm here being very pure, drinking water, and Elizabeth Oldfield, author of Fully Alive, Tending to the Soul in Turbulent Times, is tending to her soul with a Negroni.
Blood orange Negroni.
But you're doing a lot more than just ordering a Negroni, aren't you? You've done a lot of work. The title, Fully Alive, it's your ambition, as you put it, to achieve a state of full realization of what it means to be alive. But perhaps we can start really just by having you explain what you mean by that.
It's part just temperament. I lean mildly hedonist, adventurous, have a high appetite for intensity, intense experiences. Have always had this sense of, I kind of remember who said it, and it was one of those teenage quotes that I just grasped onto about sucking the marrow out of life, not wanting to miss things, not wanting life to pass me by. So I think it's part just accident of personality. But there's a kind of theological and philosophical hunch there too, which is that relationship is everything, that we are deeply interconnected and interdependent people, and that when we tend to those relationships properly, that's where life is. I'm very influenced by Martin Buber, who talks about all living being meeting. The really real is these in-between relationships, the connections between people. And then I guess the third thread is theologically, it's one of the things that Jesus said about himself, that he came to bring life in all its fullness. And that, as a phrase, wherever I've been in my posture to who Jesus was and what his life meant, that phrase has always stayed with me. Life in all its fullness. Don't we all want that?
You're a Christian?
I am a Christian.
And you've been a Christian for how long, would you say?
Well, depends how you
That's
count
part of the story, really,
yeah,
isn't it?
It is. So I was raised in a home where there wasn't any of that in the household, I would say.
Parents weren't religious?
My mum, definitely not. I now think my dad probably had a quiet Methodist faith, but it was intensely private. It was just not spoken about. We had a brief brush with the local Methodist church. It was very boring. It was full of elderly people. I didn't keep going. And I was a sort of typical precocious, nerdy young teenager, questioning the world, questioning authority, questioning everything, and then was taken by a friend to her church youth group and proceeded to pummel them with these questions about suffering and other religions and what on earth any of this could possibly mean.
Did you suffer a lot young?
Suffer?
Needing answers
No,
early?
I had a sort of almost sickeningly peaceful and lovely childhood. I think I'm just nosy, and I really like to understand things. Honestly, I think it came much more from being obsessed with novels, being obsessed with this sense of immersing myself in these grand stories that showed me the world, showed me what other kinds of lives could look like. And I grew up in this very small, safe commuter village in Hampshire where nothing ever happened.
Oh, so did I. Which safe commuter village in Hampshire did you grow up in?
It's called Hartley-Wintney.
Oh,
It's not far from Fleet. It is, I now realise, a very nice place to live, but as a kind of precocious child, I was desperate to be Welsh or Irish or Scottish or something with some grit to it.
Safe commuter Hampshire villages will make philosophers.
I think
Evidently, this was before you came to the Bible.
Yeah. I think I was reading everything I could possibly get my hands on. I mean, I was reading, all of the classic children's literature, and then The Children of Greenhoe was really a huge influence on me. I sort of went through the school library and then had to have extra shipments sent from the senior school. And it meant I just had lots of questions. There seemed to be so many different ways you could live. And I took those to the church youth group. And it wasn't that it wasn't that they had satisfying intellectual answers. at all, really. They were not particularly academic people, absolutely lovely. But they treated me with respect and they welcomed me. And they had a sense of joy and peace. And so they invited me to a big church youth festival. And I went mainly because it was, low adult supervision and boys. And there I had a very powerful, ecstatic experience.
Take us through that. What happened?
I think the thing about mystical experiences is they're not very amenable to being described in words. The point is that something happens that is not within your vocabulary, really.
You described it as an ecstatic experience just now, and then a mystical experience. Yeah. Was it both?
Both. I mean, all of the language breaks down. Iris Murdoch talks about unselfing. Maslow talks about these self-transcending experiences. People who take a lot of psychedelics, have a different language for them. In the bit of the church that I was in at the time, they would have talked about it as experiences of the Holy Spirit, charismatic experiences, We know these things happen to people, that there is a sense in which there is a thinning in our everyday and something else breaks through. And I prayed, God, if you're there, would you show me? And then God did, is all I can... I still can't talk about it without getting quite teary, because there is a sense of encounter, and I fell over on the floor. I don't know how long I was there for. And then when I stood up, I was a Christian.
I too am Christian. However, I haven't had this experience you describe as yet. I think I might have ecstasy envy or something.
Yeah.
You had this experience early on, and then presumably that stayed with you, but clearly that wasn't the answer. There were still many, many hurdles and bumps in the road.
Yes, it definitely didn't stay that simple. I had maybe 7 or 8 years of faith feeling very straightforward and lovely, and then started in the BBC in radio drama and various other jobs, and then ended up working on a TV series about the Bible, in which I was required to research a particular bit of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, which is basically a sort of Near Eastern Game of Thrones. And I had never really read it. I had not really applied my intellect to my faith, which was very emotional and very embodied and very experiential. And all of the intellectual questions that most people get to earlier, or maybe I'd got to before this experience but never found answers to, came rushing back. And the sense that the Bible was brutal or too spiky, the intellectual basis for being a Christian just didn't feel like it was there, and it all fell apart. And it was a very hard period of my life, because whenever you change your mind, particularly on big things, it affects your identity, affects your relationships. I had built my life on this thing, and suddenly it felt like all the foundations just gave way. I feel very grateful that it didn't last that long, and I found my way back. But for a long time, I didn't have ecstatic experience. I didn't have mystical experiences. That emotional, embodied sense of encounter wasn't a part of my religious practice. And I went on to run a religion think tank called Theos, and do lots of other things, and continue to be interested in this thread of what are the stories that a society tells itself. How do we set up basically the sort of metaphysical choice architecture? How do we talk about what a human being is and what a good life is, and whether the divine might exist or not? Over time, my frustration about how we talk about these deep and tender things, how easy it is to be triggered. Like, I'm well aware that some people listening to this will already have written me off. Will be thinking, who is this joker? How can she believe such nonsense? Why is she talking about religion? And there's some really good reasons that people are nervous and skeptical about whether this wisdom tradition, which has sort of self-evidently also done loads of harm, and been used against people, whether it might have anything to offer us. And so I wanted to close the gap, really, between my lived experience of something, yes, complex and nuanced and not comfy or, not primary colours. I wanted to tell a better story that felt more honest and closer to what I think is a profound and beautiful way of being in the world, whilst acknowledging, actually, there's lots of reasons to be nervous about it.
The book is structured around the 7 deadly sins, where you give your philosophical ruminations, but also painful and quite stark anecdotes from your own life. I wonder which of the 7 we can sort of tackle first. Where should we start? Which of the 7 deadly sins has been the most formative on you?
How would you feel if we started with sin itself? Because it has such terrible associations, and raising it in public, I think, can't help but make people tense up. So that chapter is called The Human Propensity to Fuck Things Up, which is a quote from Francis Spufford. And it's very deliberately sort of designed to be bracing, because the 7 deadly sins is now quite a comedy concept, right? It's a Magnum ice cream range. It's used just for clickbait. Horror films are structured around the 7 deadly sins, right? It's more of a joke concept. I sort of knew that, and there's a playful way of approaching it. But sin itself, I don't think is a joke concept, not because I'm a kind of hellfire preacher who wants to riddle people with guilt, but because, as you said, in writing and thinking about my own life and how I want to be living and be becoming more fully alive, I always felt like there was something getting in the way. There was this sense in which I think life is in relationship and is in connection to my own soul and to other people and to the created world, and yes, to the divine, but you don't have to go there if you're not comfortable with that bit yet. And this sense of fracture, of a break happening in what should be healthy relationships, should be connection, trips us up again and again, in the relationship between me and my daughter, in my attempt to live in a way that is just or loving or just free or just lighthearted, these joyful, these things we want to move towards.
Do you think the problem people have with sin is really the problem people have with hell? Because people are quite happy, those who do not identify with any religious faith, to embrace the idea of karma, aren't they?
Yeah.
Colloquially.
Interesting.
Why do you think that is?
Interesting, yeah. Yeah, I think we have these twin instincts. We want there to be justice in the world. We want there to be consequences, but for everyone else, I think we want redemption, we want mercy, we want forgiveness for ourselves, but we don't want people to get away with inflicting suffering or acting unjustly. There's this deep, complex paradox. So people like the idea of karma, I think, until they start applying it to their own life, and then they don't like it so much. And sin as a relational concept rather than a legal concept, although I think you can read my tradition in all kinds of different ways. There's not just one Christianity, there's Christianities. But sin is a relational concept which says, yes, there are these breaking points between us, but they can be restored, that sin and forgiveness, disconnection and then healing is, I don't know, I find it psychologically helpful. It's not, honestly, and this is probably where I stray to the edges of orthodoxy, it's not really connected with the concept of hell for me at all. Sin is the driver. Luther and Augustine call it homo incurvatus in se, man turned in on himself. That sin is the way we pull away from relationship. We turn back into ourselves. And therefore fully aliveness is when we turn outwards towards each other, towards the love of God. It's not really about punishment at all for me. And I think that's not the only way to read my tradition, but I'm pretty sure it's a theologically valid one.
Man turned in on himself, self-involvement, self-absorption. These are all terms that we generally still agree describe an unhealthy and dangerous state for anybody to be in.
Yeah.
But they are the natural states for people who live in a society that encourages individualism. I feel that individualism has come up time and time again on this podcast. This is the first place to start with what is wrong in our societies.
So one of the ways I think about disconnection, or I think about sin, and particularly in the sin of gluttony, as you mentioned, is disconnection from our own soul, or you can use your own deep self if the language of the soul is difficult for you. And I'm interested in how almost all Wisdom traditions grasp for these metaphors to describe the fact that one of the sort of defining lived experiences of being a human is the sense that we have many parts, that Freud talks about the ego and the superego, and that my tradition talks about the flesh and the spirit.
Thank you very much.
This looks amazing.
So here I have, if I can remember, there's an anchovy sauce over asparagus with almonds, and you've got,
I have got
very,
pure
very
asparagus
clearly,
with Parmesan emulsion.
Fantastic. So we've covered sin in broad terms, and we've covered sort of where we think that the repulsion towards the word maybe comes from.
Yeah.
Speaking then specifically about the 7 deadly sins, and those that I asked you originally were perhaps the ones that you feel have shaped you. Which one do we go for?
Yeah. The first 2, and my editor and I went back and forth about this, but the first 2 in the book are avarice, i.e. greed for possessions, and wrath. And those are the 2 that I feel are the most pressing in our time in some ways. When I think about wrath, what I'm meaning by it is the type of anger that distances us from each other. You see the contempt that is underlying so many of our public conversations. And it's a sort of cliche to say we live in divided times, but we do. Divided and divisive. And really drilling into this sense of how is disconnection showing up in this tribalism helped me understand how much actually the Christian nonviolent tradition has to offer. Thank you. Can I just have a small glass of house white wine to go with my main? Thank you. Our inability to tolerate people who are different from us or who disagree with us seems to me to be making all the other problems harder. Our deep-seated preference for people like us, scientists call it homophily, I call it people like me syndrome, PLM, which is after John Yates, is I don't know that I love the phrase hardwired, but it's, insofar as we know what that means, it's universal. Scientists see this preference showing up across cultures, across centuries. Generally, humans would much rather hang out with people who remind them of themselves, is the default. And when we start drilling into this, it's quite granular. It's people who, like, I prefer tall women when I first meet them because small women make me feel like a giant, Or there's all these studies, you can get people divided against each other based on their eye colour, based on their football team, based on where they came from. And conversely, if you can find one fact that you share with someone, you feel warmer towards them. It's slightly ridiculous.
Again, do you think this comes from a narcissistic strain in our culture?
Yes, but I'm not sure it's just our culture. I think it's all cultures. I think there's good data that... And, it's interesting where it comes from, but... When you combine people like me syndrome with fight or flight, which is this stress response that we get triggered into in situations of actual danger, but also in situations of social threat. Fight or flight shuts down our ability to be empathetic or curious or seek the common good, actually. We become very risk averse. Everyone looks like the enemy. And the combination of people like me syndrome, which is universal, and fight or flight, which is, I think, now socially endemic because of the systems and the structures we've set up in our information environment, in our demographic environment, is poison for our ability to live together. Thank you so much.
Sometimes referred to, I think this is partly what you're describing, sometimes referred to as compassion fatigue. Something that's been talked about a lot since the end of the pandemic. This idea that we had to manufacture a heightened sense of other people's well-being during those first years of this decade.
Right.
And that ever since the tail-off of the pandemic, we've moved on with this great sense that we feel like we've all lost a lot of time.
Yeah.
And we've all lost a lot of our own sense of momentum. And then everything from the sort of be kind slogan to what it's going to take in this, what we can say now will be a new general election for the UK, and everything that we need to think about in terms of how we get an entire country to move forward, is causing people to draw a blank on just how much energy and bandwidth they have to put themselves in other people's shoes.
Yeah, empathy is hard when you're overwhelmed and exhausted. I think, frankly, it's always hard. One of the things that a kind of theological anthropology gives you is quite a low view of human nature left to itself. Loving our neighbor doesn't come naturally. We need help, and we need to see it as a muscle that we grow in. We need practices, we need communities, we need reminders. We need to maybe be engaging in rituals. That there are ways in which the sort of underlying thread of the book is formation, which is this old Jesuit concept about who we're becoming. But, Aristotle talked about the powers of habit. It's not a startling new insight that who we are becoming relies on a lot on what we pay attention to and the relationships that we're in. And we are in attention overload. Caring about people not like us is really hard. And rather than make it easier by setting up institutions and an information environment to remind us to do so, we have created an environment where it seems almost righteous not to. That there is moral purity in finger pointing, in contempt, in blaming, in exiling people. And I think this is as true on the right as on the left. We signal our moral purity by drawing the boundaries around our groups. And I think that's rough. I think that's sin. I think it's disconnection. I think it's killing us. And finding in the Christian nonviolent tradition, which is this incredibly radical inspiration for the civil rights movement, for Gandhi, and for myriad other less famous campaigns, actually very pragmatic, psychologically astute tools for how we learn to love our neighbors, for how we learn to turn the other cheek, which is essentially resist your fight or flight. When you are in a situation of social threat, don't hit back, i.e. get snippy and contemptuous and try and win. And also don't run away and shut down and become passive and avoid people different from yourself. But stay in relationship, ask another question, try and stay curious. This command to love our enemies as well as love our neighbors is one of the most radical ethical teachings there has ever been. And writing that chapter, realizing my own tribalism, my own prejudice, how complicit I am in all these systems and structures, but also how much wisdom and help there is available for it, was a really deep experience for me.
Who's your tribe?
So I think we all have multiple overlapping tribes and multiple overlapping identities.
But where you've identified tribalism in you?
It's less conscious than that, Jack. It's in whatever situation we're in, we're scanning the room for people who we think will like us, actually. It's very often a search for affirmation. And it's, again, these situations where we want people to remind us of ourselves. And so I feel, a loyalty to women. I feel a loyalty to people who like novels, right? There's all these very sort of seemingly trivial things that we use to build a self. Charles Taylor says we are story-shaped creatures, right? We build a self using the available materials in a culture. And then often when we're anxious or we don't have deep roots or we're not healthy, we use that fragile, multi-layered self to draw boundaries between us and other people.
And this is where, as per the promotion of this episode, I'm going to talk for a moment about the now undisputed heavyweight champion boxer, Alexander Usyk, the Ukrainian, who I consider to be one of the most exemplary human beings on earth, frankly. I won't go into full detail about how I think this is so, but he was talking to a group of kids, I think kids in a boxing school, a sort of a training school. And one of them asked him, what does he hope most for the world? What's his biggest aspiration for a future he'd like to see? What he said was he'd like to see, and this is what made it seem so everyday, so quotidian. He said, I'd like to see the diminishment of human aggression. He says, somebody bumped into me the other day and took a defensive stance in the moment. And I just put up my hands and said, oh, sorry. And he says, you wouldn't believe how quick people are to disarm themselves when you show that you are not a threat.
Yes.
And this is coming from the undisputed heavyweight champion boxer.
Yeah.
No stranger to aggression or violence. But that was the answer he gave when asked what he wanted to see of humanity.
Wow.
The diminishment of human aggression. Anyway, never mind.
No, it's totally related.
That is a bigger subject.
So I tell some of the stories in the chapter on Roth of my experiences of this, and they're very similar. That actually, I am not in a situation of war. I'm not in a situation of physical conflict and able to apply the Christian nonviolent tradition to someone physically attacking me. But every day, we are all in those kind of tiny situations, right? And what he did is he probably felt the very normal threat reaction we have when someone's being a dick, when someone bumps into us, when someone disagrees with us, when someone threatens us. And rather than attacking back with an eye roll or a contemptuous response, he turned the other cheek. He physically embodied that command by just revealing himself to be a human being. And in that undefendedness, I have seen this happen again and again and again and again. When someone attacks me on Twitter, all it takes is saying, I can tell you're really angry. I'm sorry that upset you. Help me understand what's going on with that with you. Like, the second tweet is always sheepish. The third tweet is apologetic. The fourth tweet is lovely. You know? You can take someone from snipey to a friend in a very short series of steps. If you respond to them with empathy and compassion, and it is like ridiculous. It is a ridiculously straightforward set of practices which we can all use, and yet no one teaches them to us.
There are other sins to talk about here. I was interested in the one about gluttony, and I was interested in it because we were sat in a restaurant, and I felt that this was thematically appropriate. Yeah. So should we talk a bit about that too?
Yeah. So I have a bit of a soft spot for gluttony in its... because actually what I mean by it as a genuine source of disconnection, a temptation away from fully aliveness, is not eating or drinking a lot.
No, you say there's a difference between overindulgence and gluttony.
What I mean by gluttony is essentially numbing addictive behaviors. So I hope tonight, with this extraordinary privilege of getting to sit in a restaurant with someone else and have a conversation and eat amazing food, to pay attention to it, to notice that this asparagus that I've just eaten, which was wonderful, is a gift, right? And to notice the textures and the flavors and the sensations. And whether I end up too full or not, might be part of it. But what I'm not doing is attempting to stuff down human longings with food or booze or doom scrolling, overwork, porn usage, right? I think gluttony as a sin that we should be concerned about is very much on the same spectrum as addiction. And so it is a source of disconnection, both from our own, in my language, soul, our own deep longings for actual connection, to know and be known, to see and be seen. We stuff those longings down and we distract ourselves from them and we numb them because it's very vulnerable to go looking for the existential comfort that we actually need, which is usually in other people or, I believe, in God. And I just find so much wisdom in the recovery movement, this sense of acknowledging where we are helpless, where we go looking in the wrong places for what we need. In my tradition, there's this very stark, spiky seeming concept of idolatry, which is basically worshipping things that are not worthy to be worshipped, putting our attention on things that are not worthy of our attention, seeking comfort in places that ultimately will eat us alive. And so those forms of eating, drinking, working, whatever it is, that's what I want to root out of my life, because they're getting away in the way of my fully aliveness. Not because I really care if anyone has a second Big Mac. I don't think that's a theological concern.
Boredom.
Yes.
Boredom is a very modern malady, isn't it? W.H. Auden, I think speaking in the 70s, said something similar. He says, I can remember as a child being sad, but I never remember being bored. And he says, and it worries me. And again, this is talking, 40-odd years ago, that today children are being described as suffering from boredom. He says, that to me feels tragic. That to me feels deeply, deeply sad.
Yeah, it relates to this attention thing, right? We have allowed our attention and our formation to change our appetite to novelty sufficiently that we do not know how to see, experience the extraordinary... I mean, this is going to sound super cheesy, but in whatever room or space you find yourself, there is always something interesting, right? There is always some fascinating miracle to pay attention to, and yet I reach for my phone and doom scroll, and attending to things that are shiny and new and have fast cuts and quick pace, and the intensification and the narrowing of that world, we can just see it affecting us neurologically. I think it's therefore also affecting us spiritually. I write about it actually, but both a bit in the gluttony chapter and also in the chapter on acedia, which is the Latin word that's often translated sloth, but actually means something much richer, and it's closer to apathy, distraction, listlessness. And Aldous Huxley wrote this amazing essay on acedia, and he talks about the desire to be anywhere out of this world. This just like, this sort of ambient dissatisfaction, and it's so poisonous. It stops us seeing the gifts that we have already received.
I think about the uptick in diagnoses of conditions like ADHD, and actually when you describe that desire to be anywhere out of this world, this is what people describe when they describe a panic attack. And I think you're right. We are all of us in some kind of spiritual crisis, but what we do about it is the controversial part. And maybe we'll talk about that after we've had our mains. My pappardelle has just arrived. Could you remind the listeners what you ordered?
I have some amazing looking porchetta.
Excellent. Well, the pappardelle was delicious. How was your main?
The porchetta was very, very good. I would say 5% too salty, but I often think that.
We were talking about gluttony before the mains arrived, and I have bookmarked in the book in front of me a passage where you talk about Nick Cave and Sean Hagen's reflection on addiction, in which Nick Cave says that his addiction to heroin was a hunger for something, a remedy that he was seeking. Hunger for what, Sean asks, and he says more. The book is brave in that you are making the case for a kind of language that people just don't want to use. And I wonder to what extent this book was written in an attempt to coax it out of people, or was it just to get it out of you? How much do you hope that this gives people the feeling of permission to talk about these problems as essentially spiritual problems? Does it matter to you that people fess up?
Honestly, I'm very skeptical about my own ability to know my own motivations. I think there were lots of reasons I felt led to write this book, and not all of them are fully conscious. My prejudice is that we all have metaphysical yearnings. We all have a hunger for transcendence and for belonging and for meaning and to know and be known. And there's been a lot of shame around those things, right? That it's really changing, but for a good, probably the whole second half of the 20th century, I don't know, but certainly around and after the peak of the new atheism, the idea that you might want something other than a purely materialist explanation of the universe and something other than an individualized ethical assessment of your own actions was seen as the domain of the stupid.
Well, what's changing, do you think? Do you really think that is changing?
So I think what's changed is, well, my hunch is the kind of cultural legitimacy of the new atheism ebbed when it became, when it became clear that they weren't offering a positive vision and that there were some questionable attitudes to women and Muslims in particular. But it just wasn't an attractive, sneering at other people is initially fun. It's like a sugar high, right? That moment of contempt where we can look down on other people makes us feel good. It stabilizes our own sense of self. Again, it draws those tribal boundaries. It doesn't last. It's not nourishing. It's a sugar high, not an actual meal. It's existentially very thin. And the world is much less, whether it is or not, I don't know, but it certainly feels to be much less stable. The climate crisis is a real thing, It is too hot. It is probably going to get hotter. These things that we try to keep to the sides of our minds are going to force themselves into our consciousness. We have made choices collectively as human beings collectively as generally Western human beings, to avoid any restrictions on our own comfort and convenience in ways that have active, brutal, fatal consequences.
And the solution is not simply to dial down the temperature of the globe, which would be the rationalist, scientific solution.
If we even knew how to do that, if we even knew how to do the thing we know we're supposed to do, right? St. Paul says, I do things I don't want to do, and I don't do the things I want to do. There are things at war within us, and our rational, ethical principles are incredibly difficult to embody. We are all compromised. We are all hypocrites, including me.
But the technocrats of this world would say that the solution is very clear insofar as we know what we should do about global warming.
Yeah.
We need to bring the temperature down. What you're saying is the solution to climate change will come from a much deeper way we relate.
The problem is the human heart. It's not the information. I mean, it's partly the information, but we have known what we need to do for 30 years. The motivated reasoning to avoid that fact has been enormous. We don't want to compromise. We do not want to limit our comfort. We do not want to stop having foreign holidays. And of course, there's a role of the oil companies and all of this. But essentially, as I spell out in the chapter on avarice, we have got ourselves into a very, very serious mess because we thought more stuff would save us. We have built bigger and bigger barns and bought more and more consumer crap. And we have not shared what we have with the poor, and we have allowed hedonic adaptation to run out of control because we are not grateful and we are not generous. And these limits that I think at their best religious traditions have put on our greed, frankly calling it a sin for one thing, and I am so complicit in all this. I am such a hypocrite. That was the hardest chapter to write, realizing my desire for consumer crap and nice holidays, and to keep burning carbon because it makes my life easy, has led to people dying in Bangladesh, right? These things are not easy to stomach or to look in the eye, but the change has to come when we realize that a simplification of our lives and a reorienting of our economy might be a little bit uncomfortable for our standard of living. But it turns out that a high standard of living is not actually what helps us flourish.
We haven't covered the sin of envy, but a lot of the greed of which we're all culpable in developed countries is not just the sin of greed, is it? It stems a lot of it from the sin of envy.
Yeah, status anxiety.
I envy my neighbour, I keep up with them, therefore you over there have to suffer.
Yeah.
It's a flammable sin.
So deep in us, this longing to be of value, right? And then we get caught up in these dynamics of mimetic desire, as René Girard really helpfully unpacks for us, that there's loads of stuff we don't even know exists. And then we want it because we see someone that we respect or admire or we want to be like, who has it? And suddenly it's a must-have. And this desire to build a self essentially through products sounds like a thing that teenagers do. I think if we're honest, we all do it, whether it's the fancy coffee machine or the carbon fiber bike, or the leggings, or the facial products, or whatever it is, the desire to shore up an unstable sense of self through consumption is absolutely endemic, and I include myself in that. And to find a stable sense of self, to believe ourselves to be already of value, already beloved, to not give a shit what people think of us, or whether we have a impressive reputation on LinkedIn, or loads of social media followers, or these things that, and as I say them, I realize we all are like, well, that's not me. But if we're honest, I think it is almost all of us. We want to be of value.
Well, we do, and that's a good thing, isn't it? I mean, you said just there, not giving a shit about what other people think. That is the very tenet of individualism that kind of got us into this mess.
Okay, so I should unpack that. My aspiration is not to let other people's admiration or disdain for me affect my deep sense of self. I want to be... I have a piece on my Substack coming out about this tomorrow. I want my relationship with the divine. And the weird thing about Christianity is it has this very radical approach to human value. It says every human being is made in the image of God. Every human being is the imago Dei, is an icon of the divine, and therefore unestimably valuable and honourable and dignified. Everyone, all of them. And in particular, because the last shall be first, and the poor and the marginalized have this primacy. Catholic orders called it the bias to the poor. In particular, the homeless person and the refugee and the person with really severe mental disability, or lots of people would argue the unborn. Those who sit at the bottom of the world's status pyramid are of the most beauty and value and dignity. And it's a mind-bending concept, right? It's really hard to live it. But I want to live in a kingdom whereby how much money I earn, how hot I am, how successful I am, how impressive I am, are like dust. They pass away. They're like grass. No one actually, like, they don't have any eternal significance whatsoever. They're just like a small child posturing for their friends. How much I love people, how much I am growing in patience and kindness and gentleness and self-control, these moments of moral beauty, as we were talking about earlier, that is what lasts. That is what defines a good life. And I might spend my whole life trying to talk myself out of that first story and into the second story, but we all know, really, that all these things we claw our way into in a hope they will give us a stable sense of self don't satisfy us. We're all caught up in this extraordinary pack of lies. Sorry to preach.
No, I was going to say, we've definitely shifted gear from the personal to, in some sense, the political, the moment we started talking about climate change. And you did run a think tank, Theos, that I think attempts to place religion and faith at the center of politics. Not an easy thing to do. Some would say that you really can't create policy out of religious principles without becoming legalistic about it. But I want instead to turn away, even though we've just had a general election announced, and it would seem apt to go into that, from politics to the personal again, simply because there are people, and I know some of them, who, suffering some of that compassion fatigue, suffering that just general fatigue, are losing faith in themselves, they're losing faith in humanity. They're starting to radically lower their expectations of everything, including themselves.
Yeah.
Why should they take courage in the possibility that there is more?
Yeah. Yeah, humans can be extremely disappointing. And human institutions can be. And we are so beautiful and fragile and at our best in these moments of encounter with each other when we are unguarded. This really stretches to the edges of language. I guess I would say, I'd go back to my sense of what fully aliveness is, that it is always possible. It is always possible to move from disconnection to connection. It is always possible to move from these temptations towards life. And it's just often just takes a small step, takes a little turn, a little very tiny change in our posture towards the world. And because we are interconnected, interdependent, hypersocial, mimetic, however you want to frame it, neurologically, sociologically, theologically, when we allow ourselves to keep our hearts soft to other people, when we allow ourselves to respond to other people's hostility or aggression with grace, something changes, and it changes in us. But I think it's why I am ultimately, cautiously, and I hope in a nuanced way, an advocate for religion. Because without collective structures, ritual practices, stories, embodiment, religious practice it forms us. It's a formation machine. I go every week and I use my body and I use my imagination and I sing and I kneel and I am reminded to be generous to the poor, to confess my own complicity in injustice and ask for help from beyond me. And ultimately, I put the God chapter at the end. I call it the G-bomb, and I'm very clear that you don't have to start there to find something interesting in this book. But here's the heart of the matter for me. We need help. We need help from beyond us. And I think that help is actually accessible and comes that we can turn towards it with the question at least.
I don't disagree with you on any of that. I think there's a reason why people who go to the gym religiously talk about it as their church, because in the same way, the church can, as you say, form you. It's a way of soul building as opposed to body building, and it really can shape you, and it's about the practice, isn't it? It's about that spiritual muscle memory.
It really, I think the work of Ian McGilchrist is very helpful here. There are days when I don't believe any of it, right? It's not obvious. It doesn't make sense within the categories that my wider society presents to me. It is not that I'm always blown away with the love of Jesus. But even the days that I'm not, this path, these practices, these ideas feel like they are much more likely to allow me to stay out of a trough of despair and to be growing in my ability to love my neighbor and my ability to be a peaceful person in non-peaceful times. And so I guess I'd say you don't have to start with the metaphysics. You can start with the practices. You can start with the postures. If you have a sense that we as humans do not become the kind of people we long to be by accident, that it takes some intention. This is basically virtue ethics. You have to choose with some intention to grow in faith, to grow in hope, to grow in love, to grow in courage. None of it comes easily to me. I'm a mess. I'm like riven with hypocrisy. But without something more robust, some stronger container, I don't feel like I have a lot of hope of changing. But in this path, I do.
I am struck by how your position on this and your language for this is significantly different to the way that a lot of Christian thinkers of our time, who tend to be men, who tend to have kind of taken the crisis of masculinity and brought it into the Christian ethics, talk about these things. They talk about it as empowerment. It's all about control. Yeah,
it's interesting. I hadn't thought about it like that. I guess if I boil it down to the principle of what life in all its fullness is relationship.
Right.
And so seeking connection wherever we can. And that can be as simple as asking for help and trying to hold on to the hope that you might receive help, and you might have to look in more than one place. But the vulnerability to show up in the world as wounded as we are and as confused as we are with the people who in theory love us takes a lot of courage. I think there are ways that we've told that story in culture that can tip into sort of narcissism, but at heart I think seeking to be in relationships where you are known and you know people. And sometimes that will take a more kind of agency-led thing of seek to meet someone else's need, seek to love someone else. Like, say something kind to someone in a shop. As basic as that, like, try and show up, if you are able, with a posture of openness and kindness in the world. Because it's remarkable how that changes the dynamics for all of us. So yeah, ask for help and seek to show kindness to other people, often in ridiculously simple ways, just begins to shift things.
My last guest, Will Storr, who wrote the book The Status Game, talks about how he believes that really status is all about making others feel seen and wanting ourselves to be seen. And he says that when you do, for example, give somebody a compliment, thank them sincerely, look into their eyes.
Yeah.
He doesn't talk about it in spiritual terms, but he says this confers status onto you because it gives you the inner feeling of resource to be able to do that for somebody else. And it obviously makes another person feel seen and increases their status.
Yeah.
There is a good few hours we could add on to this to talk about everything that you write about in the book and all of its implications. But I think it's been a wonderful conversation. I've looked forward to having it with you for a long time. So thank you very much, Elizabeth, for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's been a joy.